we are going to, delve into some history of objects stuff as we go through our series. But for this first episode of the series, what is it you want to concentrate on in this episode?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about just what objects are in general. You've already sort of introduced that, and then talk about thinking in objects, and then their role in history from a computing standpoint.
Okay. All right.
If we continue on from there, the evolution into what you were talking about a little bit with some of the details of the objects and some of the nitty gritty for how we use it in UX design, including from a process standpoint. That
All right.
should be enough to get everybody well attuned to the method.
All right. So before we dive into all of that, I have one first question for you.
Yeah.
Why is it important? Why should we care about objects in UX design?
So when people say look and feel, they often don't really know how to precisely define that, right? It's kind of a vague construct. And the look is somewhat obvious from a software design standpoint. But what is the feel? The feel comes from good interaction design. And good interaction design, what we would think of as intuitive interaction design, really comes from meeting the user's mental model. And that comes from primarily this whole notion of object orientation, right? Because it's related to how we think, how we perceive the real world. And that's the power of object-oriented design.
Yeah, I remember when I did my first online Udemy video course about, it was called The Secrets of Intuitive Design, because everyone uses that word intuitive. Right. And then basically what I said was, okay, well, when you're talking about something being intuitive, I'd said exactly what you're saying, Dean. You're talking about the user's mental model. And if you're going to talk about the user's mental model, then you have to design a conceptual model. And the way you do that is with objects. So yeah, I agree with you. That's why it becomes so critical. So really what we're going to talk about in this series is how to make usable, intuitive interactions in your products.
It's the secret sauce. Right?
It is. All right. So having introduced all of that, go for it. Dive in here.
Yeah. Well, I'll just kind of give a few thoughts. And I think the first topic is really to talk about what is object orientation and object-oriented design. And so, it seems self-evident, right? Like the idea that our world is made up of objects. And so from a human factors standpoint, this gets to kind of the basics of human factors and sensation and perception, right? As we navigate through the three-dimensional world, we see objects, right? Like I see on this desk, I see my pen, I see my headphones, which are no longer working. I see these objects sitting around. And, to your point about intuitive design, right? Like, okay, the Don Norman thing about objects and affordances. I see this coffee cup and it has a handle, and therefore that is a signifier, a signal that I can grab it and use it and make sure that I get my morning coffee. So the idea is that our world is made up of objects. And so then that gets into the whole notion of how we think about our world. And as you were saying before, thinking in terms of objects. And I definitely want to get into some of the cognitive and philosophical things, but just from an introduction, I think the fundamental idea from a psychology standpoint is sense making, right? As we see objects, we need to make sense of them. That's where the idea of affordances comes in. What can I do with this thing, right? I see movement in the bushes. There's a thing there. Is it friend or foe, right? Like I need to discern from that thing based on certain attributes, including its behavior, right? What it is and what I can do with it and how useful it is or how dangerous it is. And so to that end, I just wanted to provide a definition. This is from Christopher Wickens's engineering psychology book. There are various editions, but I thought this was a good definition of objects. An object is said to have three features: surrounding contours or connectedness between the parts, rigidity of motion of the parts relative to other objects in the scene, right? So that gets to the whole perception issue, and familiarity, which is really interesting, right? Because the more familiar something is, the more that we can understand it and make sense of it. And so it's really about this whole idea of objects taking center stage in our mental world. And then the question becomes, as we go from that idea in the real world into our virtual world of computing, focused as being software designers, right? Digital designers, UX designers, interaction designers, whatever terminology we want to use. How do we take that understanding of how people think and use it to our advantage in design? So that is what, to me, this whole idea of object orientation is in not just user experience design, but in computing in general.
So some might argue that, okay, but if we're talking about designing in the digital space, not in the physical real world, we don't have to follow those preconceptions and those rules, that things have evolved and things have changed and people are used to, digital design that is separate from physical design.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's true. I think we do have to worry about it. And I guess this is the thing, as I was dusting off some material and doing some new research and preparation, one thing that occurred to me, and I don't know that I've seen anybody write about this, although actually I had a conversation with Theo Mandel the other day, and he sort of implied this, but and for people who probably don't know Theo was one of the people who was in the team in the original object-oriented UI design work that went on post Xerox PARC at IBM. So it was really IBM. We'll get to the history in a bit, but it was really IBM that sort of formalized this and codified it as method. But we were having this conversation, and I think he used the phrase object-ish or something like that, right? And what happens is we make that transition into the digital world. Like, people do this somewhat intuitively, right? And you can and will, kind of like your discussion about the usability test or whatever it is that you were in, you can and will, as a designer and as a developer, as a systems person, do a certain amount of this naturally. But there's a continuum where a design, an application, a system can be more or less object oriented, right? And so I think that the question is, how much of that is appropriate and in what cases, right? And we'll get into that when we talk more about the
Yeah, and I also want to bring up the fact that, I think sometimes people conflate object-oriented design, as we're talking about it, with clear metaphors to real-world physical objects, and that's not what we're saying. I mean, certainly you might have in your software, in your app, an object that is the same as or very similar to an object in the physical world, like a camera or something, or a microphone, and there's a physical one on your desk, and then there's also like this digital one on the screen, and you're doing settings for that. But you can talk about objects and be talking about digital objects. We create lots of containers and pieces in order for people to interact digitally with whatever tasks they're doing. And there's objects that you choose and design for your app or your software that don't have a direct correlation to a physical object in the real world. But it's still an object that someone is going to be interacting with in your app or your software. So don't assume when we talk about objects that everything we're saying, oh, everything on the screen has to be like a physical object in the real world, because we're not saying that. What we're saying, though, is that humans and the way they think and the way they interact with the world, including the digital world,
Yeah.
they have this tendency to to interact with the world in terms of objects and actions upon those objects. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that clear, because I think sometimes people think we're saying, oh, a button needs to look like a real physical button. We're talking about that level, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about conceptually thinking of something as an object to choose and then take action upon.
Yeah, that's the whole idea behind conceptual modeling and mental models, right? Is that you're using the idea of a thing. I would say, I think you bring up a great point about the use of metaphor, because that's kind of the obvious way to think about, you have the recycle bin in Windows, the trash can and the Mac OS, right? Like, here's a thing, and I can, it's this whole idea in interaction design of direct manipulation, right? Like, I can click on it, drag it, drag it, throw things in it, whatever, right? Like those sorts of things. And we'll talk about that more in depth later. But all metaphors are manifestations of objects, but not all objects manifest as metaphor, right?
Right.
That's the whole thing about conceptual modeling. And you bring up another interesting idea, and I want to use that to kind of transition into this notion of thinking in objects and object-oriented thought. And the way you described it really implies this idea of abstraction, right? How concrete or how abstract is an object in an interface? And this gets to that vagueness and that fuzziness of cognition, right? How do we think about this? And in one of our discussions about lost art and the roots of the field and everything else, we were going into the weeds a little bit on cognition, and really talked about the beginnings of object orientation and some of the philosophy even that preceded psychology. So I'll kind of give some thoughts, and then maybe you can respond to that and
Okay.
elaborate. There is this idea in psychology, kind of Psych 101, of object permanence, right? And it's coming out of developmental psychology and Piaget. And a baby sees a thing, and does the baby recognize if that thing, like a toy, goes away, that it's not away forever, it's going to come back? And at a certain age, as a toddler, I think it is, I can't remember precisely, they develop this sense of object permanence. Your dog has that same problem, right? Like, every time you leave and come back, your dog's like, oh, you're back, I didn't know you were going to come back. And so that really is kind of the beginnings from a psychology standpoint. Frankly, I think a lot of the literature around object-based thought, such as it is, there's not, I don't believe there's a ton that from the psychology realm that really centers on this outside of the developmental literature, developmental psychology literature, right? And so, we make certain assumptions about that, and I think those assumptions are valid, but there's more to be done, and there's an opportunity to really, I think, elaborate how we think about objects, what that means for adults versus infants, right? How that may or may not be different. I've got thoughts that I want to explore on that here once we get past the kind of the beginnings of this. But then also that idea from a developmental psychology standpoint of us thinking in objects really relates to some of the philosophy that preceded psychology before psychology was even a discipline. And that's one thing we were talking about. And so I don't want to go too far into the psychology yet. I've got a couple subtopics I'd like us to address, but let's start about sort of the beginnings and sort of the, proto ideas around object orientation from a psychology and philosophy perspective.
Okay. So, do you have ideas, or you want me to give you my thoughts?
Go for it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think in psychology it necessarily talks about it much in terms of objects. The two phrases I think that that psychology talks about it, and the research that's been done are probably that's relevant probably have to do with the whole idea of categories
Mhm.
and humans organizing information into categories, and that that tends to develop mainly. I mean, object permanence is, as you mentioned, is earlier, is that toddler phase, but the whole idea of being able to categorize information that occurs somewhere around the age of 7 or so. Um, so, if you think about children, and anybody who's had children know that, around that age, it's just, children become obsessed with categories. Is this, you know, is this red? Is this not red? Uh, is a dog a mammal? Is a fish a mammal? I mean, it's like, and if you look at a lot of children's games for that age group, it's all about categories. Uh, and because that's just when that whole idea really comes into play, and so categories, and then the other thing in psychology that relates is the idea of schema.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of like that container idea. So, for instance, you know, most people, if you say the word, a head, like in the part of the body, you could talk about, what's in a head? Oh, well, there's eyes and ears and nose, right? You could talk about eyes as a schema. What constitutes an eye? Oh, well, there's the eyeball and the eyelid and the eyelash, right? We have this capability as humans, and we like to do this, where we collect things together and turn that into a thing. And it gets even more complex. For instance, there's research on when someone is an expert at something, like if someone's an expert chess player, they can look at a board with chess pieces in the middle of a game, and they can tell you where that game is at, and what the last move likely was, and what the next move should be for the white side, and kind of what's going on. Whereas someone who doesn't know chess looks at that board and it just looks very random, right? I don't know, there's a board and there's pieces on the board. So then there are novice and expert schemas about things. So I think that in psychology, probably if I had to say what's the research that ties into objects, I would say it's probably schema and probably categories. But yeah, in the field of psychology research, and I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I don't think there's a lot of work that goes on specifically that's called object research.
Yeah. Yeah, I was disappointed when I did a literature review. The other thing that became very clear, and I've had this for other projects, especially in the last few years that I've been working on, and teaching, right? Like I teach human computer interaction at a university, and so necessarily delve into some of this. This is a complete tangent, but the world of psychology isn't one thing, right? So there's the developmental psych, there's the cognitive psych, there's the ed psych, and it's as if sometimes they're not even talking to one another.
Absolutely, that's true. Yeah.
Very strange. But you touched on this idea of schema, and I'd be interested in your thoughts from a psychologist's perspective about how it relates to kind of the what I think of as the proto or seminal idea around objects, right? And I would say it really goes back to philosophy and the whole idea that Plato had of forms, right? The theory of forms and the Platonic form. And so, as I understand that, the the thinking is that things have an ideal form, and humans think from a philosophical standpoint in terms of things, objects, right? Nouns from a language standpoint. And we have, talk about abstraction, we have in our head a vision, an idea, a concept of what the perfect version of that thing is, the Platonic form, right? And so everything we experience in the real world is effectively benchmarked against that, right? So curious about your thoughts about how philosophy plays into that, how Plato becomes cognitive psychology and how that relates to schema.
All right. So but you should know that philosophy makes me crazy. Okay? It
So,
really does.
okay,
Yeah.
so just for the sake of everyone's clarity, can we make sure we define the Plato thing for everyone so we're all on the same page?
What do you mean, Guthrie? Didn't
Well,
you
you
just do it?
referred to Plato and Plato's forms. Can we what's the definition of that?
Well, so first of all, we're talking
Uh-oh. And I'm like, no, let's not.
about-
And Dean's like, oh, cool. I'm going to go
If we're
look
going
at
to
the
answer the
book.
question
He's
about
looking
what
for
are your
the
thoughts
book.
about Plato's forms, we have to make sure we have it correctly.
Oh, God. He's
And first
holding
of
up
all,
a book that says Plato.
well,
Okay, I'm going to go take a
No,
break
it says
now. And you guys,
play
can you
for the
just
audience.
send
says
me a
Play-Doh.
text when you're done? No,
It's not the philosophy.
Play-Doh. Not Play-Doh, like
We're all getting out our little colored clay.
Plato. Plato. All right, go ahead, Dean.
let's see.
What
Well,
is the form or the perfect
I'll
form?
see if I can find I should have found the actual definition of the thing. And yes, it's Plato, not Play-Doh.
I like Play-Doh. I don't like Plato, but I do like Play-Doh.
Let's see if there's a good.
While he's doing that,
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, do you have it?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, you're Googling it, aren't you?
He's going to look it up online, Dean. See, Dean, there's
theory
this
of forms in
thing.
Wikipedia.
that's
go
great.
online, you type things in.
All right, so fine, I'll do it.
We'll compare
the theory of forms, also known as Platonic idealism,
yes,
is a metaphysical theory attributed to the philosopher Plato, suggesting that the physical world is not as real or true as timeless, absolute, unchangeable ideas. So ideas, according to this theory, can conventionally capitalized and translated to as ideas or forms, are the non-physical essences of all things, of which objects and matter in the physical world are mere imitations. So
this is why it makes the philosophy makes Susan crazy, right? Just definitions like that. So I think it gets to this idea of abstraction, right? So when we're talking about thoughts, and particularly abstract thoughts, the Platonic form can relate to concrete things, but the origins of it is about these abstract ideas, right? So what is beauty, right? Beauty is a thing, right? Justice is a thing. We have in our head ideas about truth, beauty, goodness, liberty, all these concepts, these ideas, and the Platonic form is the ideal form. And it's less about being a philosopher and more about just this idea that when we reference the idea of a thing, whether it's in the abstract or the concrete, as it relates from a design perspective to user mental models, there are certain expectations. That's why I like the idea of the Platonic form, because what it does is it establishes expectations, right? Susan, you referenced, a head in schema. What's a good head look like, right? What does that even mean?
And
but those are things that have variation.
But I think the point is that actually everything has variation, and we don't necessarily take that into account. And that,
what about a spoon?
A spoon has variation. It can be a big spoon, a small spoon, a tablespoon, a silver spoon. So when we are designing something, and let's just bring it back to practical things. So I'm designing an app, and I let's think about something like an app that is going to do video and audio production or something. Software that's going to do that, or even just think about something really simple like a ride sharing app, or or an app for ordering a pizza. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's complex software or something really simple. We think, we all have in our heads our own mental models of what all these things mean, of what a pizza means, of what an order means, of what a video timeline means, of what or a car service means. We have these mental models, and the mental model we have makes perfect sense to us and conforms to the Platonic idea of a perfect pizza or a perfect video timeline, whether we realize it or not. And yet, and we think our view of it is not only the best, our idea of it is not only the best, but we think everybody has a really similar idea. It's like, well, most people. So when you're the designer and you're designing the screens and the interactions, you're like, well, yeah, this is the best way to do it, and this is the way, and even if even if you say, well, not everyone, this software is for people who are new to video editing and they may not totally understand a timeline, but that's okay, because I'm going to do such a great job at displaying the timeline that they will understand it. But we don't, we forget that the mental model they have might not be the same as ours. How are we going to design this thing, and what are we going to call it so that people can quickly grasp the conceptual model we're talking about, and either that fits really well with their mental model and they go, oh yeah, that's what I thought was going to happen, or it doesn't, but they can quickly go, oh, that's interesting, that's different than what I thought, but I get what they're doing and I can use this, and maybe even this version of this thing, timeline, is better than the one I'm used to. So it is all about the decisions we make about what the objects are, what the containers are, how we display it, what we call things. And this is what makes the object and the view of that object in the digital product. Makes it easy to understand and grasp and usable versus confusing and frustrating. So, this is why it's so important, because this is kind of at the heart of how people think and how people relate to the physical and the digital world. There's an enormous amount of mental activity and abstraction that goes on in people's heads, even when they're doing something really simple.
And some of it's conscious and some of it's or subconscious, right?
Right.
Like that's part of the issue about conceptual modeling, is that it manifests, this object orientation sometimes even manifests not even in explicit objects, but in implicit objects, right? A thing is implied, it's not even necessarily named or labeled yet in our head. We have an idea about that thing, and that gets back to some of this stuff around the Platonic form and about how we think. I want to drill down on something you've touched on in that last description a couple of times, and it's what we call things.
Yeah.
Right. And because I think that is at the core and at the root of our understanding of objects, how they can be used from a design standpoint, and our understanding of thought. And one of the issues that I'm fascinated by and I have a perspective on is this whole relationship between language and thought. It's the chicken and egg issue, right? Does language come before thought, or does thought come before language? What is the relationship between the two? And this is this whole idea of linguistic determination, right? And I'm looking at my notes because I think the book that got me thinking about this is this is the trouble with having.
Guthrie, have you caught on yet that Dean really likes books?
I think books are good.
Books
a
are
very
good.
controversial opinion. Books are
well, good. So I recently had to clear off my entire bookcase, and because of how things we were doing in the house, and we had to move the bookcase, and I had to empty the entire bookcase. And didn't think I had. I mean, I've actually pruned down my books over the years. I didn't think I had that many until I had to take them off, and then I realized how many I had. And as I was going through them, I was like, "Oh yeah, I don't even need to keep these." And Dean was like, "I love books. Send them to me." So I packed up two boxes of books, and sent them to Dean. Now, what Dean doesn't know that I'm going to now reveal is Dean, yesterday another box of books got put in the mail to you.
Awesome. That's
Because as I was putting the books back on the shelf, I picked another batch that I thought, I don't want these either. I'm going to send these to Dean. So I just know that there's another box of books coming. Anyway, go ahead, Dean. Sorry, Guthrie. We did a little
well, thank you
side
for
thing about
exposing me
books.
as a hoarder. I appreciate it. Yeah, my wife is very excited whenever the big boxes of books show up.
Oh yeah. She's not going to talk to me anymore either. Okay.
Okay, so this is Steven Pinker's The Stuff of Thought, and the subtitle is Language as a Window into Human Nature. And so he's got a section on linguistic determinism, and it's a thread throughout the whole book. But there's an interesting quote here that I like, this passage anyway. If language provides a label for a complex concept, that could make it easier to think about the concept because the mind can handle it as a single package when juggling a set of ideas rather than having to keep each of its components in the air separately. It can also give the concept an additional label in long-term memory, making it more easily retrievable than ineffable concepts or those with more roundabout verbal descriptions. Right?
Yeah, and that describes, I think, really well the whole idea of a schema. I mean, that's why we have schema, right? Because we can say this is this, and it's made up of these component parts. But to me, again, I'm going to be a broken record here. Oh, I can't use that metaphor anymore. It's a generational thing.
An interrupted stream.
Yeah. Although turntables are coming back into vogue,
true.
so
Yeah.
people
my
might
teenage-
understand what it means to have a broken record. Anyway, I'm going to be saying the same things over and over. That's what I meant to say. Because language, I find myself sometimes these days in conversation with UX teams or developers about the design of a particular interface. And I will, I'll say, we have to talk about the fact that you're calling this whole thing this term. And they think it is just a terminology issue. Right. Oh, instead of calling it that, we can call it something else. But really what it is, it's an object issue. It's an object decision issue, because it's not just the name that you use, but it is what you are referring to, right? The schema behind that, the object behind that, the container behind it. And so it's not just the word. So the word is really important, and the linguistics of it are really important. But part of the reason the word is so important is because if you use the right word, it invokes an entire schema, an entire container, an entire abstraction of the whole thing. It's not just that I'm calling it, cup versus mug, right? Which it might be a larger object issue than that.
It's the idea of the thing, and I want to kind of defer this conversation to another section when we get into the details of objects. But
yeah,
to tease it a little bit, there's different types of objects, different levels of objects, right? Different granularity. There's this relationship between classes and objects, right? So,
and there's different views of the object. So you can have one object like calendar, but then you might have different views on the calendar, like weekly, monthly, daily. So this is why it starts to get a little complicated, but also why it's so critical.
Yeah.
Because I have to make, as an interaction designer, as a UX person, I have to make decisions, and I have to say, look, we're not going to have 5 different objects, one of which is the daily appointment, another is the weekly set of appointments, another is your month of activities. We're not going to make those separate objects. That's all going to be one object, and the object is calendar. And those things are going to be different views. And if you start to make that decision, right, that changes your whole interface. Oh, so that means we have to choose one of the views when they first come in, but then we want a way for them to quickly, choose a different view, but right there on the screen. So let's have them, they click here, it changes to the monthly view. They click here, it changes to the weekly view. So it changes your design. The objects you choose and the level of abstraction and things like the views of the objects, and whether you make something, whether you decide, no, we're going to have 2 different objects, or no, that's one object with different views. I mean, these decisions radically change, or should radically change, what the screen looks like, what the interaction is like, what the actions are that people take. So it's not just some little, abstract fun thing that Dean and Susan talks about. I mean, it has real world implications for design. And in our opinion, it has real world implications for the usability of the design.
Yeah, and so, that gets to this whole issue. We talk about conceptual modeling and mental modeling. One of the things that has been lost, I think, in the literature over the years, people talk about mental models a lot, but what they don't talk about is what in the early days with this stuff at IBM, they described as the user's conceptual model versus the designer's model versus the developer's model, right? And so, the idea of, well, is this an object? Is this a sub-object? Is this a class? Is this a thing? How do we present it? There's a fair amount of subjectivity in that. And so for us, the trick is, when we say object orientation is the magic ingredient or the secret sauce or something, is the idea of using that to meet the user's mental model, right? So the right answer isn't so much, I think this is an object and this is a class, but how are the users thinking about that, right? So we need to understand the user's mental model so that as a designer, we can create a design model that then matches that. And that's where intuitive software comes from.
Or if I can make it even more complicated, yes. So a lot of the times what we want to do is we want to understand the user's mental model or mental models, because not all users are the same. And oftentimes we're designing something that's going to be used by slightly different target audiences, and they may have slightly different mental models. So now what the heck are we going to do, right? So, but sometimes we design. So if your conceptual model matches the user's mental model, that's when they find the product easy to use, easy to learn. They're happy. This is great. And when your conceptual model doesn't match the user's mental model, that's when they say, I don't know what's going on. This is hard, and so on. But so we usually want to match those, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we say, look, we know they have this mental model, but we're going to change their mental model because for a variety of reasons, we need to do that, and it's advantageous to do that. And, Guthrie, this, and Dean, you've probably heard me use this. I use the smartphone as an example, because before the smartphone came out, there were definite mental models about what a mobile phone was. And many people are too young to have lived through it, but they've seen it. They've seen pictures. It was a flip phone. It had buttons. It didn't do all that much. You could send a text message, which was not easy to do. It had a small screen, and the buttons took up as much space as the screen. And that's what a mobile phone was. And so, Apple, in designing the iPhone, they did not design the iPhone based on the current mental model. they essentially wanted, they did something different. It was a computer, but you held it in your hand, and there wasn't a mental model for that. And it didn't have buttons. The buttons were on the screen, and there wasn't a mental model for that for a mobile device. So they purposely designed a conceptual model that did not fit people's mental models. And you can do that, but you have to know when you do that, that that's a huge risk. And you have to be able to set the mental model quickly. I mean, that's actually where training comes in. But you have to be cognizant of that you're blowing things up, and then it has to be designed like 100 times better than normal. So sometimes I have teams that say, "Oh, well, we're gonna, no, we're gonna do a new conceptual model. We're gonna break their mental model." It's like, okay, but that's a heavy haul. So now you really have to be extremely cognizant of the conceptual model you're designing, because it doesn't fit. And you've got to make it easy for people to look at it and go, whoa, and then create a brand new mental model, which is not an easy thing for humans to do. It takes time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, right? Because it's the old yarn about Henry Ford. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said
which is not, he didn't actually say that. I just want you to know that, but okay. Fact
but,
checker as I am.
That is the, so it's the idea of you meet people all the time who are like, well, Steve Jobs didn't ask the users.
Yeah, he didn't, right. He didn't follow their mental model, so we don't have to either.
Right. To which I would say, well, you're not Steve Jobs.
Right. Exactly.
So I think for most of us in most situations when we're doing kind of workaday design, they're pre-existing concepts that we want to leverage in mental models. I would argue that in the case that you're talking about, when you're talking about invention, you're talking about innovation, it's extremely disruptive.
Yes.
Right. So there are other considerations. Learnability is a huge consideration, but sort of the idea of walk-up usability and the sense making being immediate it makes it even more important, right? Because the user doesn't necessarily have an idea of how it works. So I want to use this as a pivot back to something you were talking about a little bit earlier. I think in those cases, it makes it even more important that you're nailing the aspects of reality that users can grab onto through things like semantics, so that they can quickly get up to speed and understand a thing, so that they don't abandon it, right? Like there's this whole notion of abandonment of technology. And when you're doing something that's new and innovative, you're very much at risk of being abandoned if people can't understand the bloody thing, straight away, right? And so what you said earlier, I think, is really important. It's this idea of labeling and, it's just words or it's just semantics, right? No, it's not just semantics. And I want to come back to this whole idea of linguistic determination and psychology with that, because it is this relationship between words and thought, right? And so linguistic determination is this idea that words determine our thought. I think psychologists like Pinker reject that. The linguistics, of course, have a vested interest in promoting that. And so, what's real? What's that relationship? I have some thoughts, but I'm not Pinker or even Susan Weinschenk. But I will say that there is this relationship between language and thought. And as Pinker describes in that one book, The Stuff of Thought, and culture, right? So like one of the stories he talks about is some indigenous tribe that they didn't have a word for counting, which didn't mean that they didn't understand counts of things or numbers of things, but they had more of an abstraction. It was at a different level of granularity. There was like 1, 2, 5, and a whole bunch, right? Like that's kind of what they had words for. They didn't have words for all the integers. And so he was basically making the case, as I recall in that passage, and there were studies done on this, that just because they had certain cultural affectations that affected their language that it didn't mean that they didn't have the thoughts or the same thoughts or ideas. Like thoughts and ideas are universal, but the language is different. And so, the primacy from his perspective isn't on language, it's on thought. I would argue that much like in our profession, we talk about the relationship between cognition and emotion, right? That it doesn't really matter because you simply can't decouple them, right?
Right.
The Watson and Crick double helix, they're intertwined, like they go together regardless. So whether the cart's before the horse or the horse before the cart, this idea of the language that we use could not be more important, right? And so what we label things is vital, right? Is
Yeah,
this
really.
cup or mug? Is it a cup or a mug, or are they glasses? Are they different types of glasses, right?
Right. And, it is, ultimately you get to the point, especially if we're talking about digital interface. And some interfaces now are not visual, right? They're
Right.
auditory or they're tactile. But basically, there's a point at which, let's just use the visual example, you're looking at something and you're trying to figure out what you're looking at.
Right.
And how are you going to figure that out? Well, it's what's on there and what does it say? If the words that are on there, the labels you've given things are critical. And if people look at the whole screen and then they look at a word that says, I don't know, I'm not even going to, the only examples I can think of are from this one client, and I don't want to get in trouble with my NDAs. So I'm just going to say, let's just say there's a word and that word doesn't make any sense to you, or or either you don't know what that is, or you're looking at what the other stuff on the screen and you're looking at that word and you're like, what? Yeah. What is that?
Well, even your example of the broken record, right? Like the language that we use,
right.
and it changes over time. Like you're talking about the iPhone. I don't think that the phone call is labeled, but when you make a phone call and you say, well, I'm going to hang up now. Well, no, you're not. Like, because that itself is a metaphor from having telephones that you used to hang up.
There's so many of these that are, you're going to dial a number. What the heck does that mean? Well, to people who are old enough, it means something very specific, and they're able to transfer that over to the new situation, and they'll still say, dial the number, even though there's no dial anymore. But I use this with one of my favorite things to do. And you teach college, and I was recently teaching college, and one of my favorite things to do is to show the save icon and ask people, what is this?
Yeah.
And they say, it's a save icon. And it's like, yeah, but what is it a picture of? And they go, well, it's just an abstract design for saving. And I'm like, no, it's actually a floppy disk. And then they look at me like, okay, why do I have this crazy person as my professor? And why are we talking about this? But yeah, so what you call things might be really important and might have, that cultural or historical significance, but maybe not, because now the save icon is its own thing.
Well, a lot of that stuff is, I think it goes with the technology jumps. So a lot of these things you're talking about, save, the ancient print, dial, these are sort of things from when a technology was young and then made that jump. So when we had a smartphone, suddenly a bunch of stuff got sort of grabbed into it.
Yeah.
When word processors came around, there's like suddenly we have a bunch of stuff that we're just sort of grabbing in, and then it just stuck around. So those are always fun, sort of easy examples.
Yeah.
Because they were new on the scene, they were the first ones, and so.
But it continues. What about the hamburger menu? What about the candy? What's it called?
The candy. I don't know.
I don't know.
It's called a candy jar.
But what's the ancient technology that a hamburger menu is?
There isn't one, as far
Yeah,
as
I
I
was saying
know.
that's just sort of that one actually is sort of like, what is it, 3 lines?
3 lines, which I guess stands for what? The bun, the meat, and the bun? I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
That's an
yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Oh,
ancient.
well, all right. So you know about
At least that one is just sort of, that one's pretty abstract, just 3 lines.
well, some of these are very abstract. So you know at you know the top of like Google, and there's the 9 dots, the squares within the square.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the candy. Where'd that come from?
Stars. People like using stars.
It's not stars though. It's little.
No, but like for favorites.
Oh, for favorites, right?
Or
right.
whatever. Like people, stars, like the shape of a star in various.
Right. Why not
ways
just circles? Right.
And so there are still abstract stuff. You know, my favorite one is
What?
the refresh icon. That one still makes sense.
This
And
that's the circle thing.
Circle, but also with like the arrow sort of at the end, eating it. That
Does it?
one's a really good one because it's
Does it make
abstract, but it
sense?
actually.
Where did
always
that
think-
come from?
Well, no, I don't know. There's sort
Go
of-
around again. I mean, that is that
Yeah.
what that stands for? I don't know.
Yeah. So, the paper airplane. Why is paper airplane the icon for like send
Is it?
in a lot of places?
Oh,
Yeah.
because you're gonna go.
Yes,
I
that's how back when you guys were kids, that's how messages got sent. People were just sort of throwing paper airplanes outside of windows.
That was not how we. Thank you, Guthrie.
Yeah, we threw
Thank you very
rocks
much.
before paper was invented.
Yeah, we
rocks with
attached-
strings attached with
yeah,
little letters.
messages to. All right, so we need to bring this episode to its close, unfortunately. Okay. But the good news is we have another 2 or 17 to go because we have a lot of stuff to talk about. But
So
Dean,
did you guys get anywhere?
Were we supposed to get somewhere?
No.
Yes, I think we did. If I was going to summarize, I would say we're introducing the concept of objects and the linguistics of naming objects. And we're introducing an idea that is critical to the whole idea of users' mental models and critical to design of conceptual models. And in future episodes here, as we continue our series, we're going to delve into a lot of details about the objects and how you decide on objects and views and all of that. And then, but also what I think Dean's going to bring us that I'm really interested in is kind of, this historical look. Again, the idea that some people out there have that this is new, and we want to show you, it's not new, and look where it came from, and look how far back it goes. So,
Dean, we're going to need more books.
Oh,
that's not a problem.
He's got all these books. He sends me texts with pictures of pages and things highlighted.
Yeah, including stuff you're cited in. Remember that last one?
Yes, he sent me this picture, Guthrie, on a text of where it talks about Susan Weinschenk says, and I'm like, what the heck? Where is this? What is this from? I didn't even.
Made it.
I don't know about that one. Or
but you have I happen to have books here, and
but he's got old books.
Oh, old books.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Dean, mention one before we end.
I know about the ancient magic.
Yeah, well, like I'll do things like, I'll be working on this university class or something. We're going to do a thing on brainstorming. Of course, there's sort of the conventional understanding. Everybody understands brainstorming, but the thing that I always am concerned with is understanding the provenance. Where does a thing come from, right? So I'll go and I'll find the book where it was originally introduced as
this is his famous thing. He's like, where was this first talked about? And he'll tell you.
Yeah. And it's not easy to find a lot of this stuff. And as I was preparing for this, and maybe in the next episode we can pick up on kind of the timeline of this.
That would be a great idea. Let's do that.
Yeah, the history of all these things gets lost, right?
Yeah.
Like I'll give you an example from management theory. there is this whole idea that, well, there are 4 functions of management: planning, leading, organizing, and controlling. And I mean, I went to business school for undergrad. My textbook had that without a citation. It was just sort of, generally accepted wisdom, but it's not something that's naturally occurring. It was invented, right? Well, who invented it and when? And if you go back and you go back and you go back, and you finally find some citations, a lot of it becomes recursive, right? And then eventually, if you can, depending on how patient you are, and if the literature is available, you can go to the source, and then you find out, well, Henry Fayol talked about this in the 40s or some such thing, and it wasn't 4 things, it was 6 things, right? And it was slightly different than when you got in your textbook, however many decades later. And so, and sometimes that's just an academic curiosity. Sometimes it really makes a difference, because what happens is I think we misunderstand things. Frankly, I think this object-oriented thought in our modern computing world is one of those things, right? It's lost, but it also gets distorted.
Yeah.
And so it's something where I think it's important to understand the roots. Anyway, before we wrap, Susan, I wanted to wrap on one idea and anecdote to kind of put a bow around this relationship between objects and thoughts, and the relationship between language and thought and culture, right? We're doing this series to talk about sort of the primacy of objects, but there's a but in there. And so years ago, I spent 3 years, and I was working in Japan. I was commuting to Tokyo. I spent 3 years working on this huge system for legal research. And it was probably the most interesting project I've had in my career. We were taking a product from the German market. We were redesigning it and localizing it for the Japanese market, doing that with the team in the US. It was, insanely complex. And it was my first experience working in Asia. And, I like to think about things through an HCI and human factors perspective. So we have this idea in human factors that we have object permanence, and we think about objects first. But as I was studying some of the literature working in the Japanese culture, one of the things I stumbled across was a book by Richard Nisbett. I think he teaches somewhere in Michigan State or Western Michigan or something. Really good writer. And the specific book was called The Geography of Thought.
Yeah, it's
a great book. And really, I think, interesting in terms of this idea of objects and whether or not it's a human factor or a cultural factor. Yeah. Right. And so, like, some of the things he talks about in terms of the studies, you mentioned earlier, the psychological literature centered around classification, right? And so one of the studies that he talked about was what we would think of in terms of taxonomies, right? From an information architecture standpoint, you have 3 things. You have cow, chicken, and grass. And so, Guthrie, how would you categorize those things? Well, pick 2 and put them together.
Cow, chicken, and grass.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that 1 is grass. That's a plant, and 2 are animals.
Okay. So you group the animals, right? And that's precisely what we would think of as this object orientation, that, well, cow and chicken are animals. They go together in a group. That is not a human thing, according to Nisbett, but it is a cultural thing from a Western standpoint. An East Asianer would say cow eats grass, and they belong together. Chicken is on the outside of that set. And so the important thing is the relationship. So from a linguistic standpoint, if you're having tea with somebody from the West, they would say more tea when they go to refill your cup, right? Because the emphasis is on the thing. Whereas somebody from Japan would refill your cup and say, drink more, because the thing itself is implied. The important thing is the fact that you're drinking. So, and like, what's reality? How much do we really know? How much do we really understand? The practical upshot for me was that in terms of my traditional object-oriented thinking and objects and actions and primacy on objects versus actions or tasks, procedures, if you will, that I actually had to invert it for that particular redesign, and it paid dividends understanding that, right? And so I'm not saying that's the case in every instance, but it's a very complex thing, this relationship between thoughts, language, culture, objects, and actions. And have to consider all of those things when you're actually working on taking this and doing something with it in the real world.
Yeah, great point. And I do love that book. I read that book ages ago, Geography of Thought. I probably had it on my bookshelf somewhere, but it isn't anymore, so I can't send it to you. But you already have it, so you don't need it. All right. Well, I really look forward, Guthrie. I don't know if you do, but I really look forward to continuing the series. Guthrie's like, oh my god, how many of these am I going to have to sit through?
You guys just go for it.
Just do our thing. You joined in a little. I'm glad you joined in.
Well, this is I am not an expert in this field, so.
But you will be by the end.
No, I don't think so.
All right.
I haven't read all the tomes.
I know. Well, get going.
That's right. I'll send you some. It'll just regift. I'll send some of the books.
Some of the books I sent to
Dean. Just dropping them back off to Susan.
Yeah, and then I'll send them back to Dean. All right. Looking forward to the next one, Dean. Thank you so much.
You.
Bye-bye.